Morning.
Let me make sure this thing's working. Yeah, I guess it is.
You need the plug, the extension?
It's got a battery.
Well, today I want to talk about fear, which I mentioned last week that Marilynne Robinson had written or had an interview in the New York Times recently in which she pointed out that she believed that fear was the default setting for most human beings. And that really resonated with me, because I think that fear is an underlying emotion that governs a great deal of our behavior. Now, fear is a very tricky thing, because there are lots of people who are aware of this and who are prepared to take advantage of it. And I think that I was talking to Gretchen the other day, who of course used to work in the advertising world, and I expressed my belief that fear is one of the principles that is, or one of the emotions that is most commonly used by people in advertising to motivate prospective customers to buy whatever it is they're selling. You know, we talk about the identity of relative and absolute. And we also talk about positive and absolute samadhi. You know, Sakita originally made that distinction in his book on the Mumonkan and the Hekigan-Roku. And also in his book called Zen Training, I believe he talks about it there as well. And positive and absolute samadhi is a lot like the relative and the absolute. And I have been discovering that this duality, and it is a duality of course, is something that we commonly use to talk about a great number of things. And if you'll remember, positive samadhi has to do with meditation that is focused on an object. You know, when I was engraving, I spent a good part of every day focused on the point of my engraver, which is a very small thing indeed. But it had a focus. Absolute samadhi is a meditation without a focus, which is what we do in this Zendo when we sit Zazen. Zazen is supposed to be a meditation that has no focus. The same dualism can be applied to fear. There is, one could say, positive fear, and then there is absolute fear.
That's true.
And positive fear is fear that has an object. You know, I know a lot of guys and girls who are afraid of spiders, or who are afraid of snakes, or who are afraid of intimacy, or any one of a number of things. They did a survey not too long ago on what Americans were most afraid of. I love surveys like this. You know, here are some of the things that we really don't like or are afraid of. flying, heights, clowns. Clowns? Really? Clowns, intimacy, death, rejection, people, other people, snakes, failure, driving, ghosts, evil powers, cockroaches, spiders, water, needles. Needles is a big one. Examinations, like, taking tests in school, public speaking. But all of these,
In other words, life.
yeah, exactly. But some of these fears can be quite specific, and you can be afraid of some of these things, but not of all of them. I mean, if you're afraid of all of them, I guess it's agoraphobia or something like that. I don't know. But absolute fear is sort of an underlying anxiety that a lot of people experience as sort of a background to their life and to their daily experience. And I think that that was the thing that Marilyn Robinson was talking about when she said that fear is the default setting for most human beings.
Was she talking about American human beings or just human beings?
Oh, she didn't say.
So
But I would expect, I mean, I think that you have to talk about the culture that you're in.
Yeah.
And I would expect that that is true for, she was saying that it was true for a lot of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if there are any societies that have members who are completely free of anxiety.
Maybe.
Anxiety, for me, anxiety means fear of or apprehension about the future. When you have, if you have apprehension about the past, it's called depression. And depression and anxiety are two of the foundations of American psychotherapy. And, but they're not very different when you look at them that way. They're very similar, but we express our anxieties and our depression in different ways. I want to tell you a story about fear. It's a Zen story. It's a story that I first heard when I was just starting practice. And I have run into it from time to time ever since. And I think it's a very instructive story. I've often wondered about it, and I'll tell you about that. The story takes place in China during the Golden Age, the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries or whatever, long time ago. And it was during a time when China was very often subject to roaming mercenary armies who would pass through the countryside and take what they could carry and burn everything else. And a monastery, a Chan monastery, found itself in its path, in the path of one of these armies. And word of their approach had preceded them, so all the monks had run away, as well as all the surrounding farmers and townspeople. And only the abbot stayed behind. So the abbot sat on his zafu in the middle of the zendo in Zazen, awaiting the arrival of the army. And eventually, the general of the army burst into the zendo, drew his sword and came and stood in front of the abbot, who was still sitting in zazen. And the general said, "You fool! Don't you realize who I am? I'm the man who can run you through with this sword without blinking an eye." And the abbot raised his eyes and looked directly into the general's face and said, "And I'm the sort of man who can let you run me through with that sword without blinking an eye." I've always enjoyed this story, but I've only recently been able to truly understand it. You know, I've often thought that the question here was whether the abbot really didn't care about whether he was alive or dead, or whether he had so much insight that he no longer discriminated between life and death. Was this story about enlightenment? What was it about? It was certainly about fear, or the lack of it, because he apparently didn't have any fear at all. Well, in recent months, I have had occasion to find myself in the position of the general, actually getting to experience what it is like to look at something that is going to kill you. And what I have discovered is this, that the abbot answered the way he did because, to put it as simply as possible, there was nothing else he could do. You know, he had elected to stay behind in the monastery because he felt that that was his responsibility. And he placed himself in a position where he had to accept the consequences, and that there was no escape from those consequences. I've had a very similar experience, because there's absolutely nothing that I can do to change the course of events that are taking place inside my body. And I have been told by some very knowledgeable people that it's eventually going to kill me. You know, the way to overcome fear is simply to recognize that our lives are very often guided by the events that have come before, and that there's nothing that we can really do about it. We make choices the best way that we can. Fearlessness, being without fear, is simply accepting whatever is. And as one person pointed out, the use of the term whatever is not the American teenage, well, whatever. which means, you know, they don't care, with a bit of aggression added to it. It means accepting things just as they are, without trying to change them. If we understand that we cannot change them, that there is nothing that we can do about our situation, whatever it may be, any fear that we might attach to it disappears. It certainly disappeared for me. I mean, there is nothing I can do here. So, what am I going to do? Add to my suffering? And there is absolutely no way I can change this reality. So all I'm going to do is make my condition worse, and it's not only going to be worse for me, it would be worse for Linda, it would be worse for you if I were to struggle against it or moan and groan about it. You know, very often the solution to our fears is found in addiction, in pursuing material things, in accumulating more money, in playing games with ourselves and with the rest of society. But if we look deeply into our life and into our daily situation, we can see that all of us are very much a product of karma. We're all a product of everything that has gone before. And we should also see that there is no difference between the subject and the object when it comes to fear. In other words, there is no difference between the one who fears and the thing that is feared. In fact, they're the same thing. You know, we learn this. This is one of the great teachings, I think, of what we call dependent co-arising. That the fear and the object of fear arise together. They're inseparable. And once you understand that, then you can begin to see that you are empowered, that you can make choices here. See? You can make choices about your fear and anxiety. You know, life is played for keeps. And that applies not only to the guy sitting in the Zendo with a general in front of him with a sword, but it applies to our everyday experiences as well. And the more we cloud ourselves with anxieties, the less freedom that we have. You know, we enchain ourselves. You know, fear is is particularly evident in this practice. You know, I think it was Tralik Rinpoche who said that fear is ubiquitous. That's the word he used, ubiquitous in Buddhist practice. And I've seen quite a bit of fear myself in Buddhist practice. I deal with students all the time who are extremely apprehensive about this practice. Because this practice can be a very dangerous thing. Because after all, what are we trying to accomplish here? And one of the things that we're trying to accomplish is to kill the self. And a lot of people leave this practice because that's something that they're not willing to face. They become too anxious about it. They may not even be able to think about it in those terms, but they become threatened, and so they leave. And unfortunately, they leave before they learn that this practice is the solution to their fears. At least I think it is. I can tell you right now that I would not be able to talk about my situation very easily at all if I had not had this practice to rely upon. And the most important lesson that I have learned is just to accept whatever is. And part of that acceptance has to do with accepting myself for whatever I am. And that includes all the good things and the bad things and all the shit that we don't want to face. One of the consequences of coming to this realization is knowing that generosity and compassion are another aspect of dealing with your fear. Because if you begin to understand what fear is and how it operates in your life and in other people's life, you can extend your compassion to them in a way that honors your own fears. I think that's one of the reasons why I spent so much time, being a hospice volunteer and working in the hospital, volunteering in the hospital when I was undergoing all those treatments. Because there were an awful lot of people there who were very frightened. And anything that you can do to help them, I think, is important. It's also important to you. And this is not all about charity, it's also about selfishness. Because it keeps you grounded, and it keeps you, where you should be. So, that's what I wanted to say about fear. Thank you.
are numberless. I vow to save them. Attachments are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. The dharmas are boundless. I vow to master them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to